Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back from your lunch. For those of you who have been with us so far today, you'll know that this is our third webinar of the day and is actually the third in a series of 5 that we're delivering this quarter. Just to signpost the ones later in the afternoon, we've got another webinar at 3 o'clock, which is all around health and safety and driving at work. And then we close the day at 4 o'clock with an update on the introduction to the basics of data privacy and the GDPR. However, for those who've joined for the first time, welcome to these calls. And just to make you aware that we are recording this call as well. So this session will be recorded and will be uploaded to the Risk Evolves YouTube page and also to the website as well, should you want to share with any colleagues. Please feel free to ask questions. As you can see in your GoToWebinar panel, there is the opportunity to ask questions or just to have a chat with us as we're going along. We have got some technical support in the background as well, so if you can't hear us or if you get stuck or anything, then just pop a message into the chat and we'll do our best to help you as we go forward. Please ask questions. Muniba has got some slides that we'll go through, but there's lots of opportunity for Q&A on any of the points that she's raised as well as we're going through. And then finally, when we get to the end of the session, Dean will close the webinar and you'll be presented with a really short questionnaire to feedback on the session today. We love feedback. It doesn't matter whether it's good feedback, bad feedback, any feedback whatsoever, things that you like, didn't like, things you'd like to see in future webinars, please let us know. So, Muniba, I'm going to let you introduce yourself in a moment, but do you want to just go on to the next slide? We'll explain a little bit more about Risk Evolves, who we are and what we do. And for those of you that don't know us, we love governance, risk and compliance. We get very excited and very interested in all things client compliance related. And as you can see there on the slide, we do from traditional risk management right the way through to looking at health and safety, environmental, social and governance, which is clearly what we're covering today, data privacy, information security, and then ISO certifications as well. So, Muniba, I'm going to hand over to you, introduce yourself, and then take us through what ESG is, the latest 3-letter acronym that seems to have hit the business dictionary over the last couple of years. Risk Evolves has been on the journey for some of that time as well, and certainly I'm going to leave you as well to explain some of the certifications that are available to organisations.
Right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Muniba Kara, and I'm a consultant with Risk Evolves. I do some of the ISO stuff, and I do the environmental or the ESG solution that we have at the moment. Today, we're going to be answering the question, what is ESG? And honestly, the best way to answer this, Helen, and I apologize to you and to the audience in advance, but the best way to answer this is to do a bit of a history lesson to see where we've come from in order to understand what it is and where we actually forecast it going. So in the beginning, and we go right back to 1983, in 1983, the UN commissioned an investigation into, very simply, the state of the world. So what's going on in the world and what's happening. And the outcome of that investigation was published in 1987 in a report called Our Common Future. So it took 5 years to complete the research, and the outcome was the first time that we ever saw the concept called sustainable development. And the premise of sustainable development was actually, or at least the argument for sustainable development, was underpinned by 3 key elements. The first is people, the second planet, and the third profits. And that's very important. So just remember those 3. So we go back to 1983 or 1987 when we first see sustainable development and the core underpinnings. Fast forward a little bit to 1992, and we see the emergence of Agenda 21. So from this point, it should all start to sound a little familiar. Agenda 21 was actually the translation of the findings from the initial 1987 report into an action plan. So how do we address all these problems that we discovered in the 1983 to 1987 research? So the problem with the action plan, though, was that, number one, it was non-binding. So therefore, there was very low or no corporate buy-in or major buy-in into the plan or into the actions that the plan proposed. Amongst the other criticisms were that the country inputs were very disproportionate, so it didn't consider multi-countries, whether from the global south or the global north. And in addition to that, a huge argument was that Agenda 21 actually ignored some major global issues. But nonetheless, Agenda 21 remained relevant until the year 2000. When the UN in talks with all the United Nations, developed the Millennium Development Goals that they expected to achieve by the year 2015. So that gave them 15 years between the year 2000 and 2015 to succeed in these Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. Here again, the reception for the MDGs was sort of 50-50. Some found it very successful and a good starting point for the plan, but there were some criticisms again, and some of the key criticisms was that it didn't quite align to human rights, so there wasn't really a human rights focus, that the goals themselves were too narrow, and again, missing out on some global issues. And thirdly, the MDGs placed a lot of responsibility on the global south, or as it was then known, developing nations. So there was a bit of disproportion again around responsibility. But the MDGs were a good starting point. And fast forward again to the year 2015, when the MDGs were meant to be achieved, we then see a re-look at the MDGs and an expansion into what we now have today and know as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And they are all 17 that we are familiar with. The Sustainable Development Goals take along all the history and all the learning from 1983 up to 2015. And we've got 17 goals with 169 targets. And ultimately, in one sentence, the SDGs are a roadmap to achieve a healthy, prosperous, and fair future for all. That's like the mission statement, if you want to. And the UN and all its parties want to achieve this by the year 2030. So what you may also hear about is Agenda 2030, and that's where all these numbers start coming from. But at this point, actually, we need to ask ourselves, where does COP fit into it? Because COP was in the news last year, and okay, it was a bit marred by some Boris scandal, but COP was a big feature. And the answer is, where does COP fit into this? Is throughout these years, COP is actually a sub-framework or another framework within the UN that is specifically tasked with addressing climate change. So one of those key goals. And part of the reason for this is climate change actually is the biggest risk to achieving many of those other goals, such as food security, other equalities, etc. So that's why climate change has such a key focus. So very briefly, all the key milestones that COP achieved. 1995 was the first COP summit, and basically what they agreed was that we should have measurable targets when dealing or looking at climate change. Moving on to 1997, the key output was the very famous Kyoto Protocol, which outlines the obligation to reduce greenhouse gases, and it defines what greenhouse gases is. So it's the 7 gases that we know today to conclude or to be part of what's the greenhouse gases. Okay. Another key milestone was actually in 2011, where all the United Nations agreed that any actions need to be legally binding, or there needs to be a legal obligation. We then move on to 2015, where the Paris agreements, and this was basically the decision of what we're going to do, and now 2021, which is how we're going to do it. So it's taken us from 1995 up until 2021 to actually have a plan of action of what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Okay, we're not going to get into the politics.
Long time to actually get this. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to get into the politics about it, but we can see or actually understand why there is a lot of frustration, because while we're debating this, climate change is being exacerbated and things are getting a lot worse. But just in conclusion, what the Paris rule book does is 3 things. And the first is that one of the key outcomes of the rule book is that governments now need to have an enhanced transparency framework for responding to emissions. And that's a very key one, because that's going to be the key driver for legislation going forward. The second outcome of the second objective of the rule book is common time frames for emissions reduction targets. That means the whole world has to be on the same time scale for reducing the emissions. So for example, the UK has the net zero 2050. that's pretty much our time scale, and the UK will be one of the leaders in setting that time frame. And then the third objective, to end of the slide, is mechanisms and standards for international carbon markets. So that goes into a whole nother section, which we can actually talk about for a couple of days, in carbon trading. And how internationally countries trade carbon amongst themselves. Right. But what is that? Okay, how does this all translate into ESG? So let's just recap. ESG is, or the ESG ratings are the assessment of the 3 core factors for measuring an organizational sustainability. And sustainability is summarized as meeting our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Right, so that's what sustainability is, and underpinning sustainability is those 3 factors: environment, social, governance, environment being planet, social being people, and governance actually being profit. So good governance in organizations actually leads to profits. So that's actually the linkage, so we can see that. But we are going to talk about a very practical view of how this looks in business. But before we get onto that, okay, we go to the next slide. There we go. How do the SDGs translate into ESG? And in this diagram, we can actually see the 17 SDGs mapped across the E, the S, and the G. And so therefore, any actions that we take, whether in a social capacity, will address some of these SDGs. The same goes for governance and environmental. Okay. From a business perspective, what that looks like, again, taking the SDGs, overlaying it on the ESG, and looking at it from a business perspective, these are some of the key reporting elements, or these are the elements that businesses will report on as part of their journey to achieve an ESG rating or some kind of certificate. And I would actually just like to take this moment to draw everyone's attention to just what's on some of the slide. Yeah.
No, well, Niba, we talked through this yesterday, didn't we? And one of the key messages we're keen to get out to any organisation who's being told or asked as perhaps a procurement process that they need to have an ESG statement, rather than looking at a blank sheet of paper or being absolutely terrified by yet another acronym, is we're finding that our clients that we work with on this journey, and indeed ourselves when we went through the EcoVadis and the B Corp process, and I know you're going to talk about that later, is that rarely, in fact, we've not found anybody that's starting with a sheet of blank paper, have we? And that is really reassuring. So if, for example, we look at a couple of the boxes that you've got on here, we were talking yesterday about things like business ethics. So this could be around sustainable procurement. This could be around having a whistleblowing process and things like that. So I'll leave you to pull out a couple of the boxes on here, but I think there is a really important message that very, very few, if any, companies are starting from absolutely nothing on this journey.
But that's exactly it. And if you were to just ask yourself as a business owner, where do I fare in the ESG world? Well, if we just look at it, for example, under social, an important element of meeting the social part of ESG is health and safety in your workplace. Do you have a health and safety policy? Do you do training? Do you actually meet your legal obligation? And if you do, you've got that covered. There's other examples, for example, privacy and data security. That's got GDPR written all over it. Under governance, as Helen mentioned, you've got an anti-bribery or anti-corruption policy. So here again, these are real-life examples of evidence that businesses already have in place that support their ESG rating or their sustainability rating, and how sustainable are you as a business. Also, just one that I particularly enjoy is the controversial sourcing, and that just looks at your procurement practices. And a key one, or a key bit of evidence there, is around anti-slavery policy, for example, or the anti-slavery legislation. You're abiding by it, you're conscious of it. So you're probably faring far better in your ESG or your sustainability standing than you might initially think. So no one is starting from zero. And to simplify this for businesses, we actually this diagram, which is the hierarchy of responsibility, takes all of those 17 goals and the long list of examples that we've just seen in the previous slide and puts it into a 4-tier pyramid. And we can again very clearly see at the bottom, the biggest responsibilities of businesses is to be profitable, because that then produces the foundation for the rest of the pyramid on top of it. So be profitable, obey the law, be ethical, and be a good corporate citizen. Develop your people, be conscious of your community. And again, that's all of that in a nutshell, or as triangle of a nutshell as we can get. Yeah. Right. So for an organization that's actually interested in looking at sustainability ratings, there are actually a number of pathways that they can begin to look at. And what I've just got here is just a couple of pathways or examples that we're going to talk to and how they relate to real life bodies or verifications. Right. So, for example, a pathway for achieving an environmental verification would be PAS 2060. There are also some ISO standards like ISO 50001, but that's actually a very specific standard for specific industries. It's actually not applicable for all businesses. And going through this assessment pathway under a strong E pathway, so where you're purely environmental, you would walk away with something, for example, like a carbon neutral badge or something that confirms that you are carbon neutral. Other more blended approaches, things that are very strong on the EG or the SG are, for example, the ISO standards. So ISO 14001 or ISO 9001. So these ISO standards give organizations the governance framework, the ability to scale processes, the ability to act in a sustainable way. So part of sustainability is, again, continuing to be profitable, looking after your people, as well as giving you the framework to introduce those environmental elements. And then lastly, the real blend between ESG would be a ratings agency, such as an EcoVadis or a B Corp. And what you would walk away from a ratings agency is either some kind of a badge. So for example, EcoVadis uses the platinum to bronze scale, or B Corp uses a rating scale. So that, for example, is 139 out of a potential 200. In a B Corp rating, it also tells you how you fare against other companies in your industry. And as you can see from the bottom of our slide, Risk Evolves has actually gone through both EcoVadis and B Corp, and we are indeed B Corp certified.
And what I like about this again is it just reiterates, especially for those organisations that have already got something like a Cyber Essentials or an ISO certification or an IASB governance certification, that once again you do not have this blank sheet of paper. You've already got some of those elements, and that was certainly our discovery as well, wasn't it? When we went through both B Corp and EcoVadis, that by having those certifications, we were able to evidence and fulfil some of the requirements of both the EcoVadis and B Corp schemes. It wasn't a question of redoing yet again, it was representing what we'd already done and what we already do. That was the key, wasn't it?
No, absolutely. So if you're starting, for example, with a strong framework in the SNG or SG pillar or SG side of things, you can very easily move laterally to the left or to the right. So to make up a bit more of that E or to have a bit more blended approach. And the same goes wherever you start with this. So starting with the Cyber Essentials, IASME or an ISO, or even if you've got a bit of environmental policies or backing or some governance behind that, you're not starting from zero. Actually, I could actually go right down to, if you have a functioning business with at least one person, you're not starting from zero on this journey. Okay, so from these pathways, you will get from these assessment pathways, there'll actually be an output after the assessment. And the pathway output can give you one of three outputs, and the first is actually a verification. So the verification is, are you doing what you say you're doing? And typically this is aligned to the PAS 2060 standard, where there are 3 levels of verification. So self-verification, where you declare as yourself, we are doing what we say we're doing. You can have an independent verification or a third party, and that would be, for example, a certifying body. from pursuing an ISO certificate, well, like I say, you could get an ISO standard or an ISO certificate that confirms you are doing what you say you're doing against a particular standard. And then, of course, the third output would be a rating, whether it's a badge or a number or a combination of the two. The sustainable ratings actually evaluate both qualitative and quantitative evidence to give you that rating. But things to consider between the ISO and the ratings agency is whether it's UCAS or non-UCAS certified for ISO standards. And for rating agencies, a good thing to always ask yourself is look at their track record. How many people are signed up with them? How many people have they rated? And then, of course, what's their geographical footprint? So how widely spread are they? As with anything, you would always want to go with a reputable company. And lastly, and possibly the most important question is, why is it important, and how can companies benefit? Well, actually, so there is some research that suggests companies who have a focus or a understanding of their ESG status, or have a rating, are actually highly risk and opportunity aware. So they're aware of risk and they're aware of associated opportunities. They actually have strong processes and clear policies and processes that actually support long-term growth. They are disposed to long-term and strategic thinking, and that actually makes a lot of sense, because if you're aware of the risks, you're aware of the opportunities, and you have scalable policies and processes, you appear as an organization, you are more agile and more responsive, and you keep growing. Also, organizations with a strong ESG focus are more prone to, or they create a lot more value, whether social value for their communities or value within their organizations for their people. And there is definitely this idea of paying it forward. So happy employees equals, I don't know, a happy company. That's a Richard Branson knockoff saying. And then, of course, a sustainable business does actually equal a sustainable future. And again, one of the key things is always be profitable. ESG ratings and sustainability is not just about, I would say, like throwing money at it. It's not just about putting all your resources towards it. That's actually not what it's about. It's about being sustainable, acting in a balanced manner. Which actually brings us to the question and answer section of this. I have included my details just at the bottom if anybody would like to contact me directly after the session, but we do have the survey. But for now, any live questions from the audience?
So one question that has come in is, possibly an obvious one, is how long does it take to achieve one of these sustainability ratings? And how much does it cost?
Okay, so that is a really good question, and it is going to depend entirely on the pathway that you choose. So if I can actually just go back to that pathway slide. So for example, if we were to go for a PAS 2060, which is heavily environmental focused, what you do walk away with is a carbon neutral badge. Depending on the size of your organization and complexity of your activities, it could take about 5 days just to get all the information organized. But like I say, it does depend on your organization. If you are involved in serious activities that have a serious environmental cost, like you're dealing with really nasty chemicals, you're involved in any kind of mining or production, that can really change or lengthen the period of verification, or the required time to get you verified. And actually the same applies for the ISOs or the EcoVadis and B Corp. It does depend on the complexity of your organization and the type of activities that you do.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of cost, unfortunately, they do vary. All of these, whether it's a certifying body for ISOs, PAS, or the EcoVadis and B Corp, the cost is determined on the number of employees, the number of locations that you are certifying, and there's a few other requirements. Again, complexity of the organization and the activities that you're involved in. But yeah.
Fantastic. And another question as well is, are we seeing any industries that are really driving on ESG compared to other industries that perhaps what industries are leading some of this change?
Well, actually, so any industry that's energy intensive at the moment, but you see they're under government a requirement. There's a legislative requirement for them to report on their carbon emissions. So any industry that's energy intensive, but there's actually a peaking interest across every industry. And different motivations. One, it's the right thing to do. Number two, there will eventually be legislation coming down, as we can see from the Paris rulebook that was agreed in 2021. So we'll see more legislation that's going to be applicable for small and medium enterprises outside of energy intensive industries.
Yeah, and we've also seen as well, there's good reports coming as well from the financial services sector as well about investors looking to ensure that they're investing in those organisations that have got a clear, and not necessarily strong, but a clear ESG statement on where they want to go. And this is around, you can't do this overnight. This isn't just a one-time activity, is it, Muniba? This is around, you do it once, and then you've got to maintain and improve the position on where you are. So it's about it's a commitment, isn't it? One thing you haven't touched on your presentation as well is around the betterbusinessact.org. So Risk Evolves is also signed up to a not-for-profit lobby organisation called, as the name suggests, the Better Business Act. The organisation's aim are to change the Companies Act to ensure that all companies in the UK are mandated to have ESG behaviours rather than it being optional. So at the moment, this is currently optional. There is momentum and that is gathering pace, and they push out a lot of really good content to organisations on how to be a more sustainable business and things to consider. It doesn't have to be done overnight. It can be small steps, isn't it? It's not all about a big bang approach to achieving sustainability. Probably not great words, big bang, but there we go. So have we got any other questions? We're hurtling towards the bottom of the hour. So
to say time does fly when you're having fun.
It does, it does. That's absolutely brilliant, Muniba. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to give us insight into how ESG works, what it is, and what some of those really useful frameworks are that are out there that can help support companies. Certainly, you know, one of the things Risk Evolves does is help companies adopt some of these frameworks, but it does make life easier, doesn't it, if you've got a framework, some sort of structure that you can put your ESG plans around. And even if you don't want to go for a certification, then we know that the likes of B Corp and EcoVadis have got some really great question sets that allow you to build those project plans to move yourselves forward. So thank you very much. We are, as I say, at 2:30, so thanks for those questions. The recording will be available on the website next week, but please take 2 minutes as well to fill in the questionnaire. So thank you very much, Muniba. Thank you.
Thank you all.